Hello and welcome. Today we are going to go through Lesson 5, Chapter 5, or Unit 5, Lesson 5 called Freedom for All. And this is Mrs. Carr and her cat Marbles, since Marbles wants to help me today. Okay, so let's first read the synopsis here. Most Americans in the first half of the 19th century believed in the perfectibility of the individual and of society as a whole. This belief led to several reform movements that attempted to find practical solutions for many of the problems that plagued American society, including poverty, illiteracy, and intemperance. Of all the reform movements in this era, the abolition and women's rights movements became the most widespread, intense, and controversial. Did they attain their goals? So if you remember from the last lesson that you read, the 5.04 Seeking Perfection lesson, that talked about other reform movements such as utopian communities, different religious reforms, like with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It also talked about the prison and asylum reform and the temperance reform, outlawing or abstaining from using alcohol. So that was the reforms that we read about in the previous lesson, and today it's going to be mostly focused on the abolition movement and women's rights. So let's continue on. All right, so we're going to do a little review first before we begin today's lesson to remind us, because we want to put all these reform movements together, but if we literally put them all together in one lesson, it would be huge. So that's why we did some of them in lesson 4 and why we're doing some now in lesson 5. So let's first go through this little activity to begin the lesson review. Okay, true or false? Reform movements in the early 19th century were mostly as a result of a stable society that was changing very little. Was society stable and changing very little? False. Okay, we'll check these and make sure we're all right here at the end. Reform movements in America were generally popular and were inspired by the religious beliefs of many church-going Americans. We'd read about that. It was the Second Great Awakening, and many people were now starting to believe that there could be change and make things better. So we're going to put true. Many reformers were evangelical Protestants whose beliefs included a focus on doing good deeds and trying to make the world a better place. And that, for the most part, should be true. Many utopian communities were founded on the belief that the work people do should be based on the good of the community, not on personal fulfillment. And what do you think? Is that true or false? I'm going to put false. We'll go back to that in a little bit. Most utopian communities were very successful and survived well into the 20th century. If you remember correctly, most of them did not last. There would be something that would fracture them apart, and they did not last into the 1900s. The temperance movement, abstaining from alcohol, advocated either moderate consumption or total abstinence of alcohol. True. I don't see why any of that statement would be false. The temperance movement was largely unsuccessful. Very few Americans took the pledge to avoid alcohol. That should be false. Many people did take pledges. The education reform movement was led by Horace Mann and Emma Willard, who wanted to create an informed and literate upper class and educate women in organizing and managing a household. That is partially false, so we're going to mark it as false. And the reason why they were leading education reform movements, Horace Mann started the idea of public schools, Emma Willard going along with that, but it wasn't for educating women to manage a household, it's for educating them so they can have a role in democracy and have their own equality. So that's why that would be false. Dorothea Dix's efforts to reform prisons and asylums were successful in some cases, but met with obstacles because most people at the time did not want to talk about mental illness. And that would be true. Now let's check them. Hopefully I got them all right, else I'd be really embarrassed. Oh, thank goodness. They're all right. So we did it. We got them all right. Most excellent. Okay. Now we're going to go back and we're going to read the pages that go along with today's lesson. And if we don't get through them all, we'll have to do a second recording. But let's look also at the lesson resources, our reading guides that we have to go along with these lessons. Here we go. And the first one, the reading guide. As you read, complete the last two rows of the Reform Movements chart in the reading guide from the previous lesson. The other lesson you filled out reform movements about like education and temperance, etc. The last two we're going to deal with today are slavery and women's rights. So we're going to look for the reformers, the goals of these movements, and their obstacles and achievements. Other questions from today's reading guide. Was America's division over slavery a relatively new issue or old issue? What were reformers who fought for the end of slavery known as? List 6 inequalities women faced in the 19th century. Which document was written for the Seneca Falls Convention to express the views of many women's rights activists? And the abolition movement in the first half of the 19th century failed to attain its goal of the abolition of slavery. Why do you think that was? And then there's going to be a document analysis for the document Ain't I a Woman? But we'll get back to that. So we're going to go now to page 342 and begin today's lesson. Starting with abolition. This top here is a part of a newspaper called The Liberator, and we're going to read about the role of that paper and its publisher, William Lloyd Garrison. So starting here, abolitionism, the crusade to end slavery. Arguments over slavery had divided Americans since the first slave ship arrived in the early 17th century. Southern slaveholders argued that the institution benefited both slaves and masters in ways that Northerners could never understand. Most Northern states had abolished slavery in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Fueled by the religious revival of the early to mid-1800s, abolitionists renewed the fight to end slavery nationwide. William Lloyd Garrison. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, a young reformer from Massachusetts, began to publish a militant anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. Deeply committed to the idea of racial equality, Garrison quickly established himself as a leading voice of the abolitionist movement. On the front page of the first issue of The Liberator, he announced, "I will be as harsh as truth and uncompromising as justice. On this subject of slavery, I do not wish to think, to speak, or write with moderation. I am in earnest, and I will not equivocate. I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." He was definitely heard. Although the Liberator was never had a large circulation, both Southern and Northern newspapers quoted it extensively. The paper's horrifying tales of slaves who had been burned alive or beaten to death soon circulated widely throughout the country. Southern newspapers dismissed these stories as lies. The state of Georgia offered a $5,000 reward to anyone who would bring Garrison to them for trial. Threats did not stop Garrison. He helped form the American Anti-Slavery Society and wrote the Society's Declaration of Sentiments, which condemned slavery as a sin unequaled by any other on the face of the earth. Members signed pledges to secure the colored population all the rights and privileges that belonged to them as men and as Americans. Their efforts led to the creation of many local anti-slavery societies, most organized by evangelical ministers and churches who saw the campaign to end slavery as a moral crusade against a great sin. Okay, just stop here a second. Now, the Anti-Slavery Society was being bold because it's saying that not only to end slavery, but there's a part in here that's going to cause some people to not support the abolition movements. And that was to secure their rights and privileges that belong to them as men and as Americans. And even people that would be anti-slavery were still very leery of giving them, African Americans, freed slaves, all the rights attributed to white men as well. So that's going to be a point of contention during the abolition movement and beyond. Among the American Anti-Slavery Society's most ambitious efforts was its Great Postal Campaign. In the mid-1830s, the organization used new steam-powered presses to mass-produce some 1.1 million anti-slavery pamphlets and mail them to Southern slaveholders. Abolitionists honestly believed these pamphlets would convince Southerners of the sinfulness of slavery. But Southerners responded with outrage and insisted the Federal Postal Service stop carrying anti-slavery literature. While many Northerners disapproved of slavery, they did not sympathize with Garrison or his tactics. Many considered him as a fanatic, and they rejected the abolitionist advocacy of equality for free blacks. See, they disapproved of slavery, but didn't agree with full equality. Garrison faced down angry mobs and was once again dragged through the streets of Boston with a noose around his neck. The police had to put him in jail for his own safety. Less fortunate was Garrison's fellow abolitionist, Elijah Lovejoy, who published a militant anti-slavery newspaper in Illinois. In 1837, a mob set fire to Lovejoy's press and shot him to death as he fled the fire. Definitely a decisive issue. Theodore Dwight Weld. In the spirit, here's a picture at the bottom of showing the destruction of that printing press. In the spirit of this age of reform, Theodore Dwight Weld, a student at the Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, had embraced the cause of temperance and education for women. When he read William Lloyd Garrison's writings in The Liberator, Weld was inspired to call for immediate end to slavery and equal rights for freedmen. When the seminary threatened to punish him for his outspoken opposition to slavery, Weld organized 75 students into a group known as the Lane Rebels. They left the seminary, and many abandoned their plans to become clergymen, devoting themselves instead to the cause of abolitionism. Weld himself was a magnetic speaker who traveled through Ohio and Pennsylvania, convincing audiences of the sinfulness of slavery and establishing local anti-slavery societies. He became so well known that his presence in the town attracted crowds of believers and protesters alike. As Weld lectured at one Ohio church, someone threw a rock through a window that struck him in the temple. When he sat down to recover, members of the audience draped their coats and cloaks over the church window so that he could finish his talk safely. The church was closed the next night, and Weld delivered his next lecture in an abandoned storeroom as a mob outside pelted the building with rocks. Okay, before I move on to that next section here, the American Colonization Society, I want to go through this as well. In 1816, several prominent ministers and politicians formed the American Colonization Society. The society tried to persuade Southern planters that it was their Christian duty to free slaves voluntarily and help them resettle abroad, where they would spread the Christianity they had learned to slaves, so basically making them missionaries. The society raised funds to buy slaves from slaveholders and send them to a land the society had acquired for a colony in West Africa called Liberia, from the word liberated. When Liberia attracted enough residents to become an independent country, its founders named the capital city Monrovia after President James Monroe. From 10,000 to 15,000 African Americans settled in Liberia by 1865. While sending former slaves to Africa appealed to some reform-minded Americans, others, including William Lloyd Garrison, were appalled by the idea. They saw colonization as a scheme to get rid of black people. However, many African Americans resisted the idea since they had been born and raised in America and were separated by generations from their African roots. And this is an idea of going back to Africa. We'll see repeated again as we do go through the civil rights movement. So keep that in mind as we will continue through U.S. history. The Grimke sisters. On the lecture circuit, Weld met two sisters who had grown up at South Carolina slave plantation. Sarah and Angelina Grimke fascinated Northern audiences with their first-hand accounts of life in a slaveholding family. The sisters explained they had always hated slavery but didn't become abolitionists until they moved to Philadelphia, when their eyes were opened to the evils of human bondage. The Grimke sisters drew audiences curious about the novelty of hearing women speak to both men and women in public. Yes, women speaking in public. At that time, women were expected to stay in the audience or limit their public speaking to female audiences. Shocked by the sisters' boldness, some New England ministers called on their fellow clergymen to keep women off the pulpit entirely. What then can a woman do for the slave, Angelina Grimke asked, when she is herself under the feet of a man and shamed into silence? Both William Lloyd Garrison and Theodore Weld, who eventually married Angelina Grimke, defended the sisters' right to speak in public. Garrison had long welcomed women into the anti-slavery movement. When the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society planned to unseat female delegates, he fumed. How mean, how ungrateful, how contemptible is conduct like this. With Garrison's support, several women were beginning to find their own voices in the anti-slavery movement. One of the most powerful was a black woman, Isabella Baumfree, who called herself Sojourner Truth. Born into slavery in New York at the end of the 18th century, she was freed after New York allowed other northern states in banning slavery. She reported that upon being freed, she experienced a divine revelation in which God commanded her to take the name Sojourner Truth and lecture on the evils of slavery. Her stories and hymns helped audiences in New England and the Midwest